going up. Elevator Systems. Bowen Family Systems Theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, where we look at Bowen Family Systems Theory concepts in brief and hopefully understandable ways. Today's episode is about family projection process. Katie White is joining me today. Again, Katie, welcome.
Thanks, Dixie.
And our guest today is Dr. Walter Smith, Jr. Welcome, Walter.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I will give a brief bio of a long career, if I may. Walter is a licensed psychologist, a retired deputy director and clinical director at the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, was both the clinical director and executive director of Family Resources, which is a nonprofit providing child abuse prevention and treatment services. He is a board member of the Pittsburgh Foundation and chair of the board of the Casey Family Programs Foundation, whose mission is to provide, improve, and ultimately prevent the need for foster care. Walter attended postgraduate training in Bowen theory at the Georgetown Family Center in the early 80s, and his career has focused on the use of Bowen Family Systems theory to understand the functioning of families, organizations, and social groups, with a particular focus on understanding family violence and child abuse from a systems perspective. So it's a real privilege to have you here today, Walter. Welcome.
Thanks. It's a real privilege to be here. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you have done hours and hours of thinking about family projection process in the context of your work and your own life. What is your elevator pitch on the family projection process?
Okay, so this concept in the theory, I think, really tries to describe patterns of nuclear family functioning in which the parental problems, undifferentiation, anxiety leads to problems in children or impacts the lives of children. Can't always say problems. I'll talk a little bit about that. But I think it's a real important and central concept to understanding family emotional process, where we look at the family as an emotional unit.
Very good.
All
Katie,
right.
what about you?
Okay, as usual, I probably will be longer than that. So I thought of it also as one of the primary emotional mechanisms to manage tension in a system. And when I was thinking about this and trying to push my boundaries, I thought it is another way of thinking about a triangle. It's a specific type of triangle, as I would think of in the system, where tension doesn't want to stay in that two-person system, a marriage. So that dyad begins to focus on the third, the child. And I think the one thing is that I appreciate about this concept is thinking that it can be in a negative or a positive way, right? The family can project in a negative or positive way. And the other thing I wanted to add in my pitch here is that this isn't something that parents do to the child, that this is a reciprocal process where the child joins in this projection and responds in ways, which I think is really interesting and unique, that I don't hear a lot about that in other theories or other ways of thinking about a system. So really kicking up that reciprocal process in the family.
Yeah. Well, mine, I was saying before we pressed record here that I have a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainties, but this is my best go. The family projection process is the way parents experience, label, and treat their children based more on their own anxieties than perhaps the facts about the children, but also how these anxieties then begin to shape the child. And that this is useful in explaining how families can have kids who function differently in life. So you can come at me in a few seconds after I'm through with Dr. Bowen. He talked a lot about this in his book. I pulled out one here. This concept describes the details of the process by which parental problems are projected to one or more children, As a part of the total theory, this concept describes the most important way family emotional process is transmitted from one generation to the next. And then in another part, I thought it was really interesting. He says, these follow the general pattern of the family process that diagnoses, classifies, and assigns characteristics to certain family members. Observations may prove reasonably consistent, periodically consistent, or inconsistent with the family pronouncements about the situation. And like you mentioned, Katie, family assignments that overvalue can be as unrealistic as those that devalue. So, oh, and actually, let me add one more. Michael Kerr, this little book here, little book, 40 pages on the concepts with lots of examples.
Will you say the name of the book
Oh,
for those who are listening?
I keep forgetting that this is not just a video. It's called One Family Story, a Primer on Bowen Theory. But he says the parents' fears and perceptions so shape the child's development and behavior that the child grows to embody their fears and perceptions. Yeah. All right. What do we notice in all the different takes?
So lots of comments, and I want to underscore a couple things that have been said. Katie was talking about the reciprocal nature of the interaction, the relationship process between kids and parents. It's really important because I think it helps distinguish Bowen theory, which is looking at emotional systems and emotional process and relationship processes, from developmental theory or people who may be thinking about parenting practices and what parents do to children. I think it's more complicated than that.
Mm.
And the reciprocal nature of this, people can have a hard time with, because people can hear it as children somehow are triggering behavior in parents that cause the children to have symptoms and problems. So I don't think that's what we're talking about. When we talk about parents' emotional reactivity to their children, we're talking about something that is like a sensitivity to children that can be pretty subtle. For example, it could be as simple as how reactive, how often parents attend to one child as opposed to other children in their family. It could be how quickly they orient towards one child as opposed to another child. I was born in a family where I was the second child with an older brother who had schizophrenia. My brother could sneeze and my parents would worry.
Mm.
You know, I could have the flu and they would say, "Oh, he's going to be fine." I mean, this sensitivity is more, it's a relationship, part of a relationship process. My brother could also get my parents to worry about him and could trigger some of the sensitivity my parents had toward him. So this process can be pretty subtle. I don't think it's always only about problems in families, because parents could have children that are special.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the kids can look really good.
Yeah.
You know, their functioning can look really high, but there is a way in which being special to parents, having parents who are sensitive to their maybe high performance, can also be a part of their later struggle in life with managing their own emotionality, their own levels of maturity, could be influence their levels of differentiation of self. So it's not always problems that are the result.
Yeah. That example is so useful to watch it then in the next generation too. So how it goes I know this is not this episode, but multi-generationally, because then that child goes into another relationship with that sensitivity and need, and that can get reciprocated in that marital relationship. And then, you know, the hits just keep on coming as they move down the generation.
Yeah, I think so. It's Dr. Bowen writes about this, but you can sometimes talk to teenagers about what kind of children they would like to have one day
Mm.
and what they imagine parenting will be. How important is it the way they will parent based on their experience as teenagers
Right.
in a family? And you can start to see the way parents are responding to their children, maybe part of a much longer process that's been going on
Mm.
and originates back in the family of origin, but gets played out in more complicated ways in the nuclear family once children are born.
Yeah. The other thing your comment made me think of was those positive projections, like on a high achieving child. And I get really interested in my clinical practice when that high achieving child launches and then the marriage gets really stirred up. And so, really, to be able to
Yeah.
watch how the focus on that high achieving child is a stabilizing force for that marriage.
I'm with you. And how often have I seen that one parent's sensitivity to one of their children is related to the other parent's sensitivity to the same child? So one parent may perceive one of their children as a favorite,
Mm.
and the other parent has a reactivity to that parent's favoritism, and then works at trying to counterbalancing that parent's favoritism by treating the child more harshly. So as you nicely said, this is part of a triangle, interlocking
Mhm.
relationships in the nuclear family. And we can go on and talk about how siblings can also play a part in all that.
Mhm.
Well, one thought I've had is the how does a parent accurately view their child? And I was something about me as I've been learning this concept, my thought is, does this mean there isn't something wrong? If we go back to sort of the problem example, does this mean there isn't actually something wrong with the child? But kids struggle. Like what if there is? And in my mind it goes back to how are the parents thinking about this? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on?
Yeah, I would say, sorry, Katie, I'm
No, go
almost
ahead. No, go
jumping
ahead.
in. I would say, I was thinking about this, that so what might it look like in the best of circumstances? So in the best of circumstances, can kids have a strong, consistent, stable emotional attachment to parents, to each and both? Um, and can the parents be loose enough that they sustain that connection, but give kids the emotional space to explore, figure out how children can use their skills and attributes that might be unique and different for each child to make their lives work in the world. So can they get curious and go out and experiment and test and have the space to do that? Sometimes I think parents' sensitivity to kids begin to interrupt that process,
Mm.
either sometimes interrupting the quality of the attachment and connection between parents and children, or interrupting, kids' ability to go explore and figure out things for themselves.
Right, right.
Yeah, I was thinking, it got me to think about, how different my childhood it was from the childhood my daughter lives and the circumstances I was, as a child of the 80s, I had a lot of autonomy, a lot of freedom. My parents did not know. I joked about how my mother and I have had conversations about what is it like to just say your children leave first thing in the morning and then they maybe come back for lunch or maybe come back when or we had to be back by the streetlights, right? And to think about what is different in her activity, whereas I have a child who I want to know, I get anxious when she's around the corner at the park and I can now well, thank goodness for parents. I can now get a device I can put on her to help manage my own anxiety and not tolerate that. So I just think about what, how do parents put their best thinking in this? It's hard work.
Years ago, there was a reporter named Charles Corralt who used to go around America and just interview people. And he found this, he was interviewing this mother who had a child that was born with no legs and arms, who figured out, like, the kid was out playing baseball with their friends and the neighbors. And he said to her, well, how do you do that? I mean, how do you not just protect this kid? And the mother was describing, well, when he comes in, he has a problem. She says, get out there and figure it out. You can do this. And so how do you get that loose, even when there are disabilities involved? I mean, how do parents, able to manage themselves to be present, to be available, but not to make sure kids don't have any struggle, because that can be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But make sure, if you're going to encourage kids to figure it out, that they really do have reasonably the resources to do that. So in the best of circumstances, this gets to be a pretty complicated process.
Yes.
And that can all be, for lack of better words, undermined by both, parents, the kids, and siblings.
Mm.
I knew perfectly well how to get my parents to worry about my brother. And I was a part of that process. So part of me managing this, it wasn't just that only soul triangle. These are interlocking relationships. So there certainly were times where I could get my parents off my back by getting them to worry about him.
Well, that was my question. What was the benefit for you to get him back?
Great.
I've studied that about my sibling as well, that she's allowed me a little looseness in my growing up life. She's allowed, the different projection on me being an oldest daughter, which we could have a whole episode probably on projections on oldest daughters. You could see 6 billion memes about that. I had responsibilities, which I enjoyed. I think another oldest daughter might have a different experience in that. But those projections based on just where someone's born get set up.
I hear you. I hear you, and I think there is understanding, when there are multiple children, the intensity of the projection process between parents and various kids oftentimes means understanding the multi-generational history, understanding what are the key events that have gone on in the life of this family, particularly during the time when children are born and early in children's lives, that may in fact represent chronic anxiety that is managed by more of an intense focus in the relationship between parents and a kid, or parents of many kids.
Yeah.
It's sort of a backwards example maybe of projection, but I had an experience this fall where my husband and we got to spend a week in the Rocky Mountains in Canada, for a little bit for work and a little bit for holiday. And it was great and busy and lots of things and beautiful things. And when I got home, I realized, I haven't worried about that kid of mine that I usually worry about. But then when I connected with them, I'm like, they were actually struggling quite a bit this week. And I thought, how did I put it? My level of anxiety in general, or feeling easy breezy because I'm on vacation, really impacts the amount that I worry about my kids. And those don't always match the reality of what they're dealing with. So that was sort of I don't know if that's backwards projection, but it made me
get into the subtleties in the process here, that the emotional focus we can have about kids can be missed and not even noticed. We normalize our sensitivity to some kids as opposed to others. Kids may have normalized that they should be a focus and figure out ways of remaining in focus. but I think you're pointing to the subtleties of this. And sometimes I've heard people try to understand this concept as if it has to do with interaction. Like one person does something, another person does something, and it's back and forth. And I think it's far more complicated than that.
Hmm.
It's about really subtle aspects of the relationship. I have a granddaughter. You can just see people paying more attention when she's in the room.
Mm.
People just notice more, and I don't think anyone's trying to do anything except just be in relationship with her. But you can see the differences.
It just gets me interested, Walter, in that. Like, what does it take a person in a family to just observe that, even to see it? Because I think as a clinician, that's sometimes the interesting work of just how do you get someone's brain interested in observing how the system functions, how they show up in the system. You know, I really I was going to mention Jenny Brown because she's thought a lot about the family projection process, and her parent hope work is to really think about Bowen's idea of what's it like for the parent to make a project out of themselves versus making a project out of their kid. And I think what a nice invitation.
There's in my work around child abuse, and it's been really helpful because I think in families where there's violence between parents and kids of some kind, you get an extreme, so you can observe the process, actually more clearly. It's more overt. People can describe, behaviors that are readily like knowable. You can have more facts about it. So that's helpful. And I do think there's some advantages in those families for people being able to make observations about themselves and their families, because it is so overt. It's we're talking about the risk of getting so angry that you're going to hurt your child, and then people can really start getting interested in observing that. I think in many families this process is so subtle, it's much, much harder for people to kind of quote see it. They see differences in their kids, and we have a whole society that so easily that can become child focused. Like, oh, your kid has a symptom, your child has these mental health symptoms, these physical ailments, whatever it might be. You need to go to a pediatrician, need to go to a doctor. We have societies that are child focused. So, oh my God, what's wrong with your kid? And the parents are asking other people, what do I do? Almost as if they're not part of the process, when in fact they may play an active role in the symptoms that their child has. But it's harder to see that role. It's harder to see that piece.
Oh, Walter, I get interested in what goes into a parent seeing that. And so you've done a lot of this work, and what would be your observation of what goes into a parent being able to get interested in their part in that reciprocal process?
Yeah, there are a couple of like overall like quote strategies I would say, but the remarkable thing I think Dr. Bowen talked about and has contributed to the field was this idea when you're looking at a nuclear family, and let's say you're talking to parents, can you flip the focus up a generation? So that the parents, instead of focusing so much on their kid, their nuclear family, can begin to refocus on what has been the process over time. What's happened in their family of origin, how does that have something to do with the way in which they're struggling with matters in their own nuclear family? And it's almost predictable that it's all tied together because, it's one emotional system. But I think when people start to see it at a little bit of a distance, and the generation where they were children and their nuclear family of origin, it begins to light up something for them to be able to see it. A second one is helping people take a look at how marriage plays some part in parenting. You know,
It does.
we have societies where we could talk about parenting, you know,
Right.
let's talk about this in child welfare. We could talk about this about child abuse without ever talking about marriage. It's like, come on, you know, I think what parents do with kids has something to do with what's going on between them. And if people can begin to see that their emotional sensitivity and reactivity to their kids or a child is in part related to shifts and changes that are going on in the relationship and marriage, then I think something else lights up in terms of insight. They can begin to see they have a part in this.
Yeah.
And then they might be able to get more interested in, well, how do I manage myself? The third one is oftentimes what I see is, and this is kind of general, but parents are asking their kids to manage something that the parents aren't managing for themselves. You know,
What are we having for dinner?
if my kid would just, you know, do this, I wish my kid would calm
Right.
down. And then how do you begin
Right.
to, you know, draw a parallel between, you know, I think it's a reasonable request asking your teenage daughter to better manage her emotional reactivity and self-regulate. Hey, you know, what about you? You know,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and then I think that also can light things up.
Well, I was thinking about how is this similar or different to how evolutionarily adaptive it is that we attune to threat in others, and how is it helpful when I maybe pass down my concerns about how you handle money or how blah 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 blah, and then when does it become much less helpful? Because I think there's something to, you know, I've learned some things, I'm gonna pass it on, just like my kids are all amazing musicians and they took all my skills probably, right? And then they take some other things from me.
Oh, you want me to answer?
Well, I don't know.
That's a great question. What
It's
do
a
you
great
think?
question.
What would you say? What's your guess at that one, Dixie?
Well, I think it's just, I mean, it goes, it's like there's a sweet spot of this is an adaptive process, and then it becomes, you know, less helpful or too intense, or now we're too sensitive, or we aren't sensitive enough, or now we're too sensitive. That's kind of where my thinking goes.
My answer would, in response to your question, I mean, I don't know if I can answer it per se, but I think this is where this whole concept in Dr. Bowen's theory about differentiation of self really comes in. Like, what is regulating? You know, what capacity do we have to regulate through our thinking system what we do with our kids? How much of that is automatic reflex response? And that's not a bad thing, but
Right.
if I notice I need to self-correct, to what degree can I, you know, use my thinking, my beliefs, my ideas, my plans, my strategies, my goals to kind of begin to regulate and manage my own functioning in order to self-correct. And I think there is something in that about differentiation of self, and that varies among us. And you see in some families, you'll see people say things like, I was abused as a kid. The last thing I'm going to do is abuse my kids. And
Right.
so they do. And then it's like, oh my God, you know, how did that happen? Without much capacity to recognize that this is all part of an emotional process. And their functioning is so much more guided, as all of ours are to some degree, by emotion than it is by thinking.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's the struggle for us humans.
Yeah. I was thinking your question also hits on the intensity aspect of, you know, how much intensity goes into each mechanism. I was watching that Chalk Talk with Dr. Bowen where he was talking about that there's a fixed amount of immaturity that is present in all families, and that varies based on their level of differentiation. And so that immaturity's got to go somewhere, and kind of thinking about how does that show up in different families.
Mm-hmm.
Another project to think about.
Well,
and the thing I'm just going to add, I think that, of course, the other piece besides differentiation itself and the theory, the two really principal ideas that really explain function are differentiation of self and chronic anxiety. So if you get enough that goes on, enough events, enough threats, then, there's an overloading of our adaptive capacity, and you just are likely going to get symptoms. Now, how long they last, how intense they are, also varies by levels of differentiation of self. But just the number of events, so often in the families that I've seen where there's child abuse, you get some fairly high functioning families that have incidents of violence, but what you predictably see is so many threats, stressors have occurred that people are fairly overwhelmed, and symptoms pop out.
Yeah, I guess you're hitting on kind of the importance of a context of a stressor, like the overlap of acute and chronic stressors.
Yeah, there's acute stressors, and of course how we adapt to those has something to do with whether stress becomes chronic, but then there's also the frequency of them. You have a family the other day, 4 deaths in 3 months of major family members. These are pretty overwhelming challenges, and it's, what do you do with that? A symptom pops up for a while that's around aggression or irritability, or in this case also a depression. And it's not, are those symptoms adaptive? I would say yes. Speaking from an evolutionary perspective, or ways in which people are doing the best they can, and symptoms also bind and manage anxiety. They're not always a problem to be getting rid of.
Yeah, that's such an important thing to kind of punch up, that the usefulness of anxiety.
Yeah, it's also an important thing to think about the usefulness of focusing on your kids. Everybody wants to protect those poor little kids. But they are part of how families as a unit also manage complexities like stress and threats.
I was thinking about to take us in a slightly different direction, but the movie Home Alone, where Kevin is the problem child, and yet when you look at the broader number one, I was thinking, as you're saying, the stressors, right? Slept in for our flight, all that kind of stuff, and who is the problem in that family, and how is the family functioning around the stressors? And Kevin actually kind of figures some things out while the family is floundering. And so I was thinking probably any movie or TV show who is presumably the problem character, the antagonist, or thinking of, Wicked, the movie is out right now, and that's like just the great reversal of who is the bad character and who's the good character. And I think, I don't know, it's just a useful way to observe some of these processes when maybe it's harder to see in our families.
And how do you even decide what a problem is? Are kids who get straight A's, but do it more to please their parents, or to meet some external idea about what others expect of them, is that a problem? I would say yes.
Right.
Hard to talk people into that one. But I would say it's easy to get locked into defining a problem by the way other people or society generally looks at it. The people who have symptoms or have the problem, and the people that don't are okay. And getting beyond that thinking is a real struggle for all of us who take on this theory.
It made me think, and I'll tell you, Dixie, where this is from, because I didn't pull up the quote, but it made me think of this article Phil Klever wrote on marriage the Victoria Harrison's journal, the Family
Systems Forum.
Yes, thank you. Family Systems Forum, where he ends it really interestingly of asking, how do you decide what's best? Is a marriage where all of this is locked up in conflict, or is it better if the marriage does a little better and the focus is on the child? And I thought that is just so useful to help me get more objective as a clinician and then someone thinking about their own family. I can be real judgmental about how people function in my own family, and just to the discipline of staying objective about getting interested in the process and what I can do with it, versus saying, well, my family's better because we're managing it in this way, whereas that family's, and I think that's one of the things that I find useful in theory.
I cannot tell you how often it was when I was clinical director and executive director of a pretty large child abuse prevention and treatment agency. And what we saw repeatedly was when the symptoms in children went down, the abuse stopped, kids were in therapy, got better, symptoms start popping out in other parts of the family. When you went in and you did intervention, you stopped sexual abuse, divorce was often the next step. So you would see a family relatively stable, unfortunately, where there was also abuse, and then you interrupt the abuse and symptoms also shift and change. And I would always challenge my staff. It wasn't about Bowen theory, but it's just an interesting observation that Bowen theory describes, that all of this is so interconnected that it's not about a person having a problem that belongs to them as an individual. It's about an individual reflecting something larger in the way a family is functioning. And that shift in thinking is very challenging to get to.
Yeah. And the
most of our society don't. We still have lots of ways in which we want to bring children in for services because they have symptoms, and parents want someone to figure out what to do with it.
I was speaking to someone the other day who was saying that their long-term dream might be to run an agency that addressed children's problems, but said they wouldn't see children and really have it take off. I said, good luck to them.
My child abuse program, we decided that when parents brought abused kids in, that even when they were the perpetrators, oftentimes they would not get involved in treatment. And so we would not see the kids until the parents were in treatment for 3 months. And if the parents dropped out, even after that, we would stop seeing their kids. And it was a way of holding parents accountable. It worked fairly well, but lots of funders got pretty angry with us for because they gave money for us to help kids.
Yeah,
and they're pretty upset when we would end the treatment. Our argument was pretty predictably, and I had lots of staff who were not systems thinkers, but pretty predictably, when the parents would drop out of treatment, not get involved, when the kids made progress, their progress meant they would start to talk or address things with parents that would really trigger parents' anxiety. Then the parents would sabotage the treatment.
How interesting. And the effort of principles, how does an agency, how does a parent develop principles that they can try and stand on?
Yeah, you were going to ask us to have a question at the end, and I was...
Yeah, take away question idea.
Which is, if you were to design a social service that provided services to children, but you did not want to replicate the family projection process, what would your service look like?
There you go. I'm going to pass that question on to my friend.
Yeah.
What would be the elements? What would be involved in that? How would you manage? You know, if a family comes in and they say, my child's the problem, would you just say no? Well, you know,
Yeah.
they're doing the best they can. You know, what are the strategies you would use to not be a part of the projection process in the family? And what would the design of that service look like?
It's a great question.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope someone listening takes you up on that.
Katie, do you have anything you want to add in terms of takeaway?
My takeaways were, I think, just the effort that Bowen went into thinking about that this exists in all families. Every single family, to some degree, has a child projection process, a family projection process. And so how do you just get interested in observing that in a way that's useful to you, that helps you think about your part in it? So that was just my, my takeaway, is just to get people, I think my takeaway is often get people observing.
Yeah.
What about you, Dixie?
Well, I was thinking about the Parent Hope Project, the number of resources that they have. And then Kathleen Smith wrote a great article that I go back to many times, and it's called Where is All Your Energy Going? And just a reminder to we point as many thoughts back to ourselves as we do to others. So
yeah. And I think, just Jenny Brown also has a podcast that we could link people to, that she's done lots and lots of thinking about this concept in particular and how it's linked to the other ones. And so I think if people are interested in learning more about it, there are lots of places to go.
Yeah. Any other thoughts to add, Walter, at the end? Can we have you for 3 more hours?
Absolutely. No other thoughts. Not for now.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Pleasure.
And yeah, for those people who have tuned in, I hope we've sparked lots of thinking as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.